Hello, so my name's Emma Christian, as Kane's just introduced me. I work as a people consultant in the people projects team, sitting within the employment team at Napkins. Natalie, do you want to just explain about yourself?
Yeah, so my name's Natalie and I am one of the solicitors in the employment team at Napkins. So I assist businesses on an advisory basis, so queries and questions about day-to-day employment issues I assist with. But another part of my job is that I also deal with employment tribunal claims. So I will also deal with sort of the other side of this, in terms of where things might not go so well and how we deal with that. So that's also something that I'm going to talk to you about today.
So we just thought, just before we do start, just putting the questions back out to yourselves really. What experiences have you had with flexible working? Have you had any horror stories that's why you wanted to come on here today? Or is it that you just want to get a little bit more information about how to conduct that process? Did anyone want to comment?
Hello. I think for me, yeah, it's just kind of a new process for me, but we've had quite a few requests recently, everything to do with COVID and everything. So for me, it's just kind of advising the line managers and things like that. So yeah, more of the process point.
Okay, great. Linda, did you want to add anything?
No, it's also just for the general information. We've had requests over the years and we've dealt with them, but I'd like to know your take on it.
Brilliant. Okay, that's fine. Well, so hopefully this will be useful for you then. And we are just going to take you through the process really, so you understand the do's and the don'ts, really the best way of handling the process. And the pitfalls really that you may come across when you pick up a request. And obviously, given where we are today with COVID-19 and the impact that that's having on many businesses, then obviously, that may change your perception of flexible working as a business, and therefore will support in terms of advising you how probably to best handle that as well. So let's get started. There we go. So we've already introduced ourselves, Emma Christian and Natalie Parkinson. We'll move off there. My picture's awful, so we won't hang around too long on there. So as we said, introductions, we're going to talk about what's meant by flexible working, the advantages and disadvantages of flexible working, the types of requests that you might get, making and granting the request, reasons, the legal reasons as to why you may not want to accept a request, and how you can get that across to the employee. And then we'll talk about some potential claims and remedies, the importance of your policies and contracts, touching on the COVID-19 and what this new normal might look like, and communication. So what is flexible working? So anything that's outside of the standard contracts of employment essentially is deemed flexible, and it might well be that you have a 0-hour contract that is therefore quite flexible in its nature anyway, or you might have somebody who is on a fixed hour contract, so somebody who's working 9 to 5 Monday to Friday, on say 37 hours a week is a typical standard full-time contract. That doesn't work for everybody, and there's lots of different reasons why someone might want to stray away from that kind of contract. Statutory right to flexible working requires 26 weeks service, and we need to make sure that you've got policies in place really, so you can communicate that out to your employees and they have a point of contact of knowing how to put a request in. The biggest question essentially that you should be asking when we're looking at flexible working is, can that person still perform the role? And that's the biggest thing. What's the impact going to be on the business? If they put in this request and they want to work 3 days a week, how is that going to impact the business going forward? So who can make flexible working requests? So employees. but not agency workers and employee shareholders. So it's anybody who's employed by the business worker can put in a flexible working request. There has to be a minimum of 26 weeks continuous service. So if they do come and go, that will mean that they don't qualify. Now, in terms of this 26-week service, that's for them to have. You as a business may want to stray away from that and be more flexible. So you might have a relatively new employee in the business who may have a change in circumstances, only been with you, say 3 months. You are still able to consider that request. The only thing I would say is that you need to take into consideration of precedents. You need to then be consistent with other employees who may want the same flexibility. They are only allowed to make one request every 12-month period, and that is regardless of whether or not it's accepted or declined. So that needs to be communicated as well very clearly. And again, the note here saying that if we've received a request from anyone else, need to seek advice from HR. Now, if you do have an internal HR function or you are working in HR, you need to be aware of who else in the business is putting in the request and what is going on. Now, one of the things that we do come up against from lots of clients is that we don't want to open the floodgates. That isn't going to be, when we talk about reasons for declining, that isn't going to be a strong enough defence to decline a request, and therefore we do need to consider a request at the time it's made. So that's why it's quite important to know who else is making requests at the time, because we need to take that into consideration in terms of order of acceptance of declines. So talking about potential advantages, and then obviously we're in a new world at the moment with COVID-19. There's been lots of changes in the country and across the world, in fact, and the way that businesses have been operating in just a way that we can all keep functioning. We ourselves are all sat in our homes, and we've been doing that since March, and it's likely to be the case now well into the spring. And that in itself requires some element of flexibility. However, there's lots of other things that have been put in place in terms of changes of hours and more agile working in general, just to be able to cope with the current climate. But we take ourselves away from that at the moment, because this is quite a unique period of time, and it may well be that we do change permanently to adapt what we've done. However, it could be that we need to look at going back to where we were because of the nature of our business, and once we're back into things. So let's remove ourselves from the COVID-19 and let's think of ourselves just back where we were at the beginning of the year. So potential advantages of flexible working. So we might have a more efficient and productive organisation. We may have a more empowered and motivated workforce. And the reason being is that when employees feel that they're getting something back from their employer, they tend to be more committed to their role. And if they're not worrying about having to get home, the nursery or school, and have that element of flexibility, then they tend to be more productive during their working day. There are some studies around the world, and there are certain countries that have different types of working practice. So there are some employers that are trialing different types of working practices, such as condensing hours into a 4-day week, so that they are working longer hours in the 4 days and giving them back that extra day a week. So there's different things that businesses can do to try and encourage that motivation and productivity, and that can be done in general. But in terms of the individual, there's lots of reasons why they may put a request in. But another motivational thing is that we might get better customer service, increased customer loyalty, increased staff retention and attractiveness to potential employees. So again, when we talk about benefits, I've done a recent piece for one of our articles on benefits and where we are at the moment, and businesses are having to look at the benefits they offer. The gym membership, or the bowl of fruit in the office, for example, isn't really going to cut it. But flexible working, being able to offer that flexibility to employees is really, really important. And I think it's becoming more and more expected as well. It can create a reduction in levels of sickness absence. So where there could be a medical issue, you know, encouraging that flexible working or changing the way that they do work in the week may also enable them to work longer hours or otherwise not take as much time off sick. And there is the potential to save money as well. So if you've identified, actually, we don't really need that person in 5 days a week, and they're hoping to go down to 3 days, that might avoid a potential for redundancy in the future. So it's certainly worth considering and looking at it in terms of whether or not we actually really need that person in for the hours that we've got them working currently. It also creates other opportunities for other employees as well. So where you might have somebody who is doing a job share, for example, you know, you could have people that are able then to upskill into other areas of the business and share more working practices, so that people are able to work more agile and have more cross skills, which again will help in terms of increased motivation, productivity, and retention as well, because people might feel more interested in the work that they're doing. So in terms of disadvantages, of course there are some disadvantages. Formality of procedure, so it's really important that you do follow a procedure when you do receive a flexible working request. If we don't have a paper trail of the request and your considerations, that could cause a claim going forward. It does take time to deal with a request because we do need to show that consideration. So there may be some analysis work that needs to go into considering the request. There could be some additional costs as well. So if it is that somebody does want to reduce their hours, it may be that you need to recruit an individual to backfill the hours that are not being worked, and therefore there's going to be some recruitment costs potentially and training costs. The hassle, just general hassle of reorganising the work, again, is quite negative. And the adverse impact on other employees in terms of morale. So, you know, if you agree a reduction in hours for somebody, the other members of the team may feel resentful of that, because they may feel they're having to take on extra work because that other person is not in the office quite as much. And therefore it could have an adverse impact on team performance. So there's lots of things that could be requested, as we've kind of alluded to. Part-time is probably the most common still in terms of what is considered as a flexible working. The less common, but still possible, is the full-time, where somebody has a change in circumstances. Maybe the kids have grown up actually now and they don't need to work those part-time hours any longer. And therefore they want to go full-time. Annualized hours, and that's where you calculate the total number of hours over a whole year, and then it's worked flexibly. Often warehouses like manufacturing and production or retail warehouses can work like that, where you've got seasonal requirements, and you might increase your hours when it's really, really busy, but actually then have lower hours, but you could have your pay averaged out over the whole year. Compressed hours, so that's not reducing your hours, but it's just working longer days, and we do need to be mindful, making sure from a working time regulations perspective that you're having all the necessary breaks, but again, that's sometimes a good way of giving some more flexibility to an individual where you're not losing the amount of hours that are being worked. Home working, well, I think that's probably one of the most common things that we're up against at the moment, and naturally all businesses are being asked where possible that their employees work from home for the foreseeable, and there's a lot of businesses now that are actually considering whether that's going to be a more permanent thing. So again, we need to make sure we've got everything that's set up correctly for that individual to enable them to work from home. Flexi hours, so again, not necessarily reducing their hours, but just being able to work those hours on a more flexible basis. So it might not be possible if you work in a call centre, for example, where you need to be logged onto a phone and you're calculating the number of calls that you might have coming in, and therefore you need a certain amount of workforce to take those calls. However, you're working in an office environment, it may well be more practical to work more flexibly, and therefore, you know, you might say, well, you've got core hours because we tend to have meetings, or we have clients or customers contacting us between the hours of say 10 and 4, and therefore their core hours, but anything around that can be worked quite flexibly. Job sharing, again, another great way where you may have somebody who's looking to reduce their hours. So typically speaking, you're talking around the 16-hour per week kind of contracts that would be quite handy to have a job share. So if it's a permanent full-time contract, normally around 37 hours a week, working a job share of say doing 2.5 days or 2 days and a free day works really, really well. Obviously, the individuals that are concerned need to be very, very organised and be able to do good handovers in between that to ensure that that work feels smooth between the two parties. And that does sometimes cause issues, but can work really, really well. Staggered hours, so that might be that you change your hours on a weekly basis, or you might stagger them with other employees. So you might have one employee coming at 9, another employee coming at 10. So you've got that cover within the business, but again, you're giving those employees flexibility. A compressed working time, we've already really covered that. Weekend work, again, weekend work is something that may not normally be considered, because traditionally you may work a 5-day week, but does it matter? Does that person have to work Monday to Friday? Could they work a Saturday or a Sunday to give more flexibility? And does that actually open up more doors for the business? Or is that going to cause more issues around supervision and things like that? And these are all the things that you need to take into consideration when a request comes in. Flexible holiday leave, again, you know, it might well be that somebody wants to take holidays in order to have more flexibility. We can do that as long as they are making sure that it is used for rest, and that they are taking the relevant time in line with their contract. Self-rostering, again, is very just flexible working in terms of they'll put themselves down for when they feel that they're able to work. But again, you need to have some kind of control measures put in place to support that. And term time working, so this is very popular in the education sector, of course, but a lot of businesses will recruit people because they know they've got working mothers, and therefore the time that those people need to take off are the hot school holidays, and it's an ideal situation. And the contracts reflect that they are only employed typically during the term periods, and therefore holidays are taken into consideration around that. So there's lots of reasons there that people might put in flexible working requests, and they're not always childcare related anymore. I mean, traditionally speaking, it probably was related to a care situation, but there's lots of reasons now. So what must the request be for? As I said, you know, previously it would have been more for around caring responsibilities, but under the new regime, which has been in place now for a number of years, that's no longer the case. You know, people who get a new puppy, who want to welcome the new puppy into the home, it can take a good 12 months to get that dog trained, house trained, and be in a position where you can leave them. It could be that you just want to slow down and actually don't want to work full time anymore, and you just want to have a little bit more flexibility, a bit of me time, and therefore it would work better. So there's lots of different reasons as to why someone may put that request in. There could be medical reasons around that as well, and we will touch on that because that's slightly different, because that might be considered more in line with reasonable adjustments rather than a traditional flexible work request. But somebody who may not really know what their rights are in relation to that might put in a flexible working request in and cite medical reasons as the reason behind that. So we do need to take that into consideration. So how does an employee make a request? So it should be in writing, should be dated, and it should state that it's being made under the statutory procedure. It should specify the change source, when it should take effect, and it should explain the potential impacts of change on the employee and how this could be dealt with. It should state whether a previous application has also been made as well and when that was made. The easiest way to get around this is to put together a very simple form for your employees to complete. If you leave it open to them just to put a letter in writing, I'll guarantee you most of that information will be lost and that won't be on there. And then you will need to go back to them and ask them for further information. So a simple form which says date, employee name, maybe start date, so you've got that on record, and then covering off each of those points that are listed there is an easy way and a consistent way of getting an application. It's easy then for the managers to read through and consider it. The most important question to ask an employee, in fact, whilst obviously the obvious, we need to know what they want to change, is that impact question. Because what they don't understand a lot of the time is the impact it's going to have on the business and how that can be dealt with. So asking them that question can actually avoid quite a bit of conflict during an actual meeting with the individual. Asking that question will put them in your shoes for a little while, and they're thinking, well, I know Joe Bloggs has to take on this amount of work, and if I'm not there, he's going to have to take my work on as well. So how is the business going to accommodate that? And it just puts them in the shoes of the employer just for a little while, for them to actually consider how it might be able to be worked. And when you get to a meeting to discuss that request, it's a lot more straightforward because they've already thought about that, and they may have some really good suggestions for you as to how we can maybe accommodate what they're asking for. Has anybody got any questions around that at the moment? No? Okay. So how should an employer deal with the request? It needs to be within a reasonable time, and the actual real period is 3 months from start to finish. It can be longer if agreed by parties, but 3 months is ample time for you to go away, analyse the situation and consider that person's request and assess whether or not it's something that you can accommodate.
That date period as well, it's really important that you keep track of that. So when that request comes in, one of the most important things that you should do is log it, so you know, and you've got a record of when the request has been received, because you know these are areas really where these things can go wrong. There was a case that went through to the Employment Tribunal a few years ago now, going back to sort of 2016, but it was a case against Tesco. And you might sort of think, oh, big employer, they'll definitely have procedures in place in which to deal with these things. But what happened there was the delivery driver, he submitted a flexible working request. He put it through to his team leader, who said, oh, no, it's not for me, you know, I don't want that. Eventually passed it on to an assistant manager, but he had kept a record of when he tried to submit this request. They failed to deal with it. They failed to deal with it within the 3-month period. And they didn't respond within that time. So what happened is the employee contacted ACAS. He commenced a claim against Tesco for their failure to deal with his request. In the meantime, they'd had a meeting and they dealt with the request, and they knocked it back. They said that they weren't prepared to grant it for potentially valid reasons, because it didn't work and they didn't have an available shift that the employee was looking to move to. But when the claim went to tribunal, the employee succeeded with bringing a claim against Tesco for their failure to deal with his flexible working request. And that was as a result of really them just not keeping a track of the timeframes of these things coming in. It's just really important that you understand, you know, when it's been received and who should take ownership of that. And then, you know, when are we arranging meetings to discuss it as well? Because the last thing you want to do is sort of end up in a position whereby you're found to be at fault purely because of administrative reasons, when actually your reason to refuse the request could be, you know, genuine.
So from that, we need to have a meeting with that individual to discuss the request that's come in. So once you've received it, you've noted down when that request has been received, we need to be inviting them to a meeting. And the ACAS Code of Practice suggests that a meeting should take place ASAP. There should be a written invitation. There should be a right to be accompanied. It should be held in an appropriate venue. And the point is there to discuss the request with reasons with the employee. It's really important that meeting is a two-way discussion, and that we're not giving the outcome in that meeting, because we need to be able to demonstrate we're going to go away and we're going to consider that request. Now, occasionally, it might well be that you get the request and straight away you can accept it. Now, whilst best practice would still suggest that you should have a meeting, I think under those circumstances, as long as there has been that due consideration, it would be fine just to write back to that individual and confirm that you're happy to accept that request, to avoid wasting meeting time, etc., just to be able to say, yes, we can do it. But we do need to be making sure that we are demonstrating that we're showing that consideration, and that it is something that we will consider. And if we do need to maybe make some suggestions of alternatives, etc., that is when we definitely have a meeting. In terms of the venue, we need to make sure it is a private location. So, I mean, in today's world, it'll likely to be in a setting similar to this, over Zoom or Microsoft Teams, etc. But to make sure that there's going to be no disturbances, and it is held in a formal capacity, just as it would do in an office setting. But if you are in the workplace, it shouldn't be just at your desk. It should be booked in a meeting room and treated in the same way as you would do like a disciplinary, for example, and treat it with the confidentiality that it deserves. So in terms of continuing with that, explain the potential impacts of change on terms and conditions, on employment, reduction in loss of hours, reduction in loss of pay, and whether or not it's a permanent change. We need to discuss the potential impact of that change and how does the employee see it working in practice, and do you see any changes to the request need to be made? So what happens after the meeting? So we need to carefully consider the request, weigh up the positives and the negatives, consider what would be the reason for a refusal, and confirm a decision in writing within decision periods. So what we need to ensure there is that if we are going to decline the request, it falls into one of the 8 legal reasons to decline a request. We need to confirm the decision that we have in writing within that decision period, and we need to be able to show from a consideration point of view that we have weighed up those positives versus the negatives. So if we're granting the request, that needs to be put in writing as a contractual variation. It needs to confirm whether or not it is a permanent request or not, and it needs to be a new contract or variation letter to be issued. And we need to be asking if there's a trial period there. In terms of when we are looking at granting or declining requests, it's always better if we can ensure that we are considering whether a trial period is something that can be put in place. Even offering a trial period, even if we know it's not likely to be something that we can accommodate, it will always look better on you as the employer if you can demonstrate through that trial period it definitely doesn't work. It stands you in much better grounds if they do try and pursue any potential claim, that we can demonstrate this has been the impact through this trial period and it absolutely does not work. So in terms of those 8 reasons for declining requests, so it's the burden of additional costs. So that's maybe where you need to recruit an individual. You cannot reorganise the work amongst existing staff. You cannot recruit any more staff, and that might be because they work in a specialist role, for example. There'll be a negative effect on the quality. So because you've not got those members of staff working, that's going to have the impact on that. There's a negative impact on the business ability to meet customer demand. There's a negative effect on performance. There's not enough work for your employee to do when they've requested. So that might be that they want to come into work earlier in the morning, but actually because they work in a retail establishment, that we know that it's extremely quiet in the mornings, and actually in the afternoons they're much busier, and therefore that's when we would want them to work. And there's planned changes for the business, so that might be that there's changes ahead, and therefore you don't want to put the request in and accept it at this stage. We do need to be mindful with that, obviously, and it's a bit of a tricky one, that one, because if you know that you're going to be making changes but you're not yet communicating that to the workforce, that might be quite difficult to communicate back to the individual. So rejecting or refusing the request, so there's no longer a statutory requirement to include a sufficient explanation as to why the particular ground for refusal applies, but it is still good practice. We need to be aware of inadvertent discrimination, and as I say, that might be connected typically to a medical condition in most circumstances, but again, it could be that the employee has a son or a daughter, for example, who has a medical condition. So it might not be the employee themselves that has it, but the employee's son, daughter, or other family member that they have caring responsibilities for, and therefore there is the risk of discrimination by association as well. So we do need to be mindful of that. And there should be really a right of appeal should they not be happy with the outcome to their request. So I think we're at a good point to ask any questions now. Does anybody have any questions to date?
No, thank you.
No? Great, okay. Carry on then. So Natalie, do you want to take over there?
It's hard if I unmuted myself first, but yeah. So I think, where you get to in terms of the process that we've discussed thus far, I think it's pretty apparent that it's really key that we keep accurate records. And one of the main things that I would say, thinking with sort of a tribunal hat on here, is your paper trail. It's really important that you keep a paper trail of, the initial letter received from the employee, any considerations that have happened, meetings that have taken place. We've taken minutes of those meetings, and ultimately where we communicate our decision, is that communicated in writing as well. And the reason why all of that is important is because if this were ever to go wrong, and obviously that is entirely what you would want to avoid, and really why we do things like this and we look at what the correct procedure is, you want to evidence that as an employer you've done everything that you should have done to consider that request appropriately within the relevant timeframes, and that you've been reasonable and acted reasonably in considering any request that has been received. So I think in terms of flexible working, it's pretty apparent that whilst an employee can make a request, that request will not always be granted and it won't always succeed. And your refusal as an employer of that request, that may well be entirely reasonable. And as Emma said earlier, it's important that yes, an employee may have a right to work flexibly, but equally that has to be balanced against the employer's right to manage the business. And there is a real balancing act that has to take place there. So just because an employee may be unhappy with a decision that you've made, if you've had to refuse that request for whatever reason, that doesn't necessarily mean that your refusal is unlawful. But there are obviously occasions when an employee may be able to take action. So the first of those really is under Section 80H of the Employment Rights Act. So the right to flexible working is set out within Section 80 of the Employment Rights Act, and that's where you would sort of have a look to see sort of how that's set out there. But if an employee is going to look to bring a claim under that section of the Employment Rights Act, they're going to look to do that, and they're going to look to say that either their claim was well founded, and they're going to look for reconsideration or request, and they could be awarded up to 8 weeks pay as compensation. And in terms of whether they can take that claim further and whether they can look to take action against the employer, they may be able to do that if they're able to demonstrate that the request that they've made is reasonable and it's workable, and we therefore as the employer have unreasonably rejected that. And that's whereby, the documentation that you've noted when the request has come in becomes really important in terms of you demonstrating why that may not be the case. They may also say that we haven't followed correct procedure, or if they've made a statutory request and we've ignored it or we've not followed the procedure properly. Again, that may then lead them to be able to bring a claim and result in them being able to achieve the awards that are set out there on the screen. So going back to the Tesco case that I mentioned earlier, the employee where he'd said, I've made my request and my employer's not dealt with it within the 3-month time frame. That employee was awarded the maximum there. He was awarded 8 weeks pay compensation, and that is subject to the statutory cap on a week's pay, but you know, it can end up being sort of a substantial amount of money. But actually where I think the real risk sits with these claims, if you just the next slide, Emma, is in respect to discrimination type claims. And that is whereby an employee will say that the request that they've made and your refusal to deal with that request in the right way has resulted in them suffering some form of discrimination. So if an employee, for example, has depression and they're to say, I need to work later, I need to start work later in the day because I really struggle with early morning starts because of my depression, and we unreasonably refuse that request, they may well be able to demonstrate that we as an employer have discriminated against them. And in terms of potential awards and what that employer may then sort of find themselves having to fund, if it's the case that your refusal is not well founded and you could have, you know, sort of facilitated that request, the employee could look to receive quite a substantial award from the tribunal in respect of injury to feelings. And injury to feelings is the compensation, you know, that's how the compensation is addressed. But that can run to sort of tens of thousands of pounds, which can be quite obviously, you know, really detrimental to an employer. So again, it's really important that when these requests are received, that you don't just dismiss them out of hand, you actually pay them, you know, sort of dues and really consider them. So I think in terms of potential discrimination type claims that could arise out of a flexible working request, the most obvious one that springs to mind is, as we've touched upon really previously, is sex discrimination. So that may be, you know, the straightforward thing that you think of in that, you know, a female asks for certain hours because of childcare responsibilities. If we're to refuse that and we could have facilitated it, then, you know, that may well be found to be discriminatory by a tribunal. However, if we're to refuse a request for a male you know, for flexible working, and we might already have a female that's you know, been granted a flexible working request because she may have childcare needs, he may similarly be able to mount a discrimination type claim because he may say, you've refused my request, but you've granted the request to a female that's in the same position. That may also sort of lead to a discrimination type claim as well. Religion or belief. So if somebody's to ask for adjusted hours because of their religious beliefs or because of a need to worship, again, that could lead to a claim. That is, you know, more unusual, but I have had a claim of that nature that I represented a claimant within. That employee had said that they would not be able to work weekends because of their religious beliefs. And we succeeded at tribunal with that claim, and that claimant, you know, was awarded a sum of money for that, but for the employer unreasonably refusing that request. So it's just important that obviously we really do give due consideration to everything that we receive and we really think these things through. Disability. So you might have, as I've said there, you know, somebody with depression that asks for adjusted hours to facilitate them being able to work at the time of day that fits with their condition. That's just something to be mindful of as well. And as well as obviously sort of discrimination type claims, an employee may also look to say, I've made this request for flexible working, which I consider you to have unreasonably refused. And as a result of that, I'm no longer able to work for you. And in that situation, they may look to bring a claim of constructive unfair dismissal. And if it's found that obviously they are to have, you know, not been able to continue working for you because of your response to that request, and that's found to be discriminatory, then that claim may succeed as well. So, you know, there are all sorts of potential pitfalls here. So it is just really important that we, you know, really give consideration to all of these types of requests that are submitted. And again, our thought process around that. The other thing that can happen, and the other thing to be mindful of, is if an employee is to look to say that they have made a request, and that request is for, you know, one of the protected characteristics, which are things such as sex, religion or belief, disability, etc. And we are to refuse that request. And they then believe, as a result of the request that they've made and your refusal, they think they've been treated poorly thereafter. They may also look to say that they've suffered a detriment as a result of your refusal or as a result of the request that they've made. And they may look to bring a claim on that basis as well. So it's just really being mindful, I suppose, of you know, the request that's made, our reasons for refusal or to grant, and just making sure that we've really thought about it. And just because it's not something that we've done before, we don't dismiss a request out of hand as something that we can't do moving forwards and in the future. In terms of sort of how that claim works, the employee must bring that claim within 3 months of hearing your decision, of hearing that you've retreated their request as withdrawn, or the date by which you should have responded. So if you should have responded by a set date and you've not done that, then that would then be, you know, sort of the trigger point for the employee to issue their claim at tribunal. The next slide, Emma. Alongside that, there are obviously sort of further problems that can result that are not just tribunal claims. Obviously, that's the big one, but there are other issues that can arise out of this. So sickness absence, grievances, victimisation, which I've sort of touched upon there, whereby they say, I've made this request and my employer was really unhappy with it, and as a result of that, I feel that they're now victimising me. That again can lead to discrimination type claim in the tribunal. And resignation, so again, that point around constructive unfair dismissal. And all of these things, particularly sort of sickness absences and grievances, they can obviously, you know, create a lot of extra pressure upon an employer in terms of time, cost to deal with them, need to cover duties, etc. And, you know, it's just, you know, never a very nice, you know, position to find yourself in, where an employee ultimately is really unhappy because of, you know, the way in which we've dealt with the request that they've made. And I think that's really why these lines of open discussion between the employer and the employee are really important. The more that we can engage in dialogue with an employee, and as Emma said, really, right from the outset, making them think about sort of our side of this and how will it impact upon the business, you know, that the easier that process will be in terms of having an understanding of each party's respective positions. Have we got any questions at this point? I appreciate I've just gone through quite a bit for you there.
No, none from me.
No? Lovely. If we move on then, Emma.
Yep.
So obviously it's important that we ensure that company policies and contracts are appropriate. So I think we've sort of already touched upon that. But it's important that we think about, you know, what is the difference that the request would make, and, you know, how would all this impact upon flexible working? One size never fits all in these types of situations. And as I've said before, really, just because we've not done something previously, it doesn't mean you can't do it in the future. And an employment tribunal would never really consider that to be a justified reason to refuse a request. The fact that we've not approached something in a certain way before doesn't mean that we can't do that in the future. So it's important that obviously we just really think about every request that we receive. Again, the importance of the paper trail. As you know, an employment lawyer that will deal with these claims, one of the most you know, important things that we need, and the key documents for us, are all of the notes, letters, you know, any documents that we have that can demonstrate how we have dealt with that flexible working request. Because if, as Emma said, we've received a request, we've met with the employee, and we've potentially facilitated maybe a temporary arrangement to see if it works, and it doesn't work for whatever reason, if we're able to demonstrate that and we can say, well, actually, yes, we did receive the request, we gave it a chance, these are all the reasons that it didn't work, and this was the time frame over which we set it over, and as a result, moving forward, we decided that that just couldn't work for us, that's going to place you in much better stead than you sort of, you know, out of hand dismissing something, and certainly whereby you've not got that paper trail. Because if an employee is to take a claim to the tribunal, and this is obviously, you know, any type of claim ultimately, that is going to go before a judge and potentially a panel. So it might be a judge sitting on their own, or it might be a judge with some members with them. And they've got to decide, who do they believe? Do they believe you as the employer, or do they side with the employee? And the more that we can give them by way of documentation to demonstrate how we've dealt with things, the better it will place us as employer and as respondents to that claim to sort of swing their view over to our side, where we've done everything that we need to do, really. So I can't really emphasise enough how important that paper trail is, and keeping, you know, accurate records and documentation. And as we've discussed, obviously, discrimination risks as well, and, you know, the potential of that. So it's not just thinking about this from you know, what could the risk be of the failure to deal with a flexible working claim, the claim of that nature. For me, I would say the bigger risk really sits around discrimination type claims. In terms of sort of my experience, in the whole time that I've been dealing with employment tribunal claims, I don't think I've had a single claim that's solely been about a refusal to deal with a flexible working request or a failure in procedure. I have, however, had untold amounts of claims that relate to discrimination as a result of a request for flexible working, and that for me is really where the bigger risk lies. So I think when that request comes in, it's important that you sit and think about what is the reason for the request, and why is it that this employee wants that, you know, wants to work flexibly. Because the expectation is that, you know, as an employer, you will do everything that you can to try and facilitate it where possible. But that point around where possible is really important, because as I said really at the beginning, just because the employee has made the request, it doesn't mean that you have to grant it. You know, it's important that obviously you do balance the employee's request against the needs of the business. And if you genuinely cannot facilitate that request, and it's not going to work, we need to just communicate that in the right way, so that, you know, we ensure that, you know, yes, we've thought about it, but this is why it can't work for us, and, you know, that we're explaining that in the correct way, really. And if you are struggling with that, then I would just suggest that it's important that you take advice, because what you don't want to do is have a genuine reason to refuse it, but the way in which you've communicated that to the employee then leads to a claim. It's just important that you do sort of what you can really to cover that off in the correct manner. Have we got any questions?
No, none from me.
No?
No.
Okay, we should move on. So, the dreaded word of COVID-19 and where we're at the minute. I think we all know, obviously, we're currently working very differently to how we were working back at the start of the year. I'm currently in my conservatory. If the rain on the roof, you can hear that. So it's a very different world in which we're working. And I think, you know, more and more people are working flexibly, either by, you know, their own desire to do that, or, you know, need and, you know, government pressure at the moment. You know, we're just, obviously we're all having to adapt and work differently at the moment. So more people than ever before, I think, now are working from home and are working flexibly, and are adopting different methods of working. A survey has actually been recently completed by Working Families, and that says that 90% of employees want employers to maintain flexible working practices that have been put in place as a result of COVID-19. And I think that's a pretty striking figure of, you know, 90% of those asked want to continue working in a flexible way. So I think, you know, now is probably an appropriate time to sit and think about, you know, will it and is it safe to continue in the way in which we're working at the moment? You know, because obviously we have to work in this way now doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to work for all businesses moving forward. You know, and it's something that obviously, you know, I think all businesses really are going to have to think about in terms of how we move forward, you know, looking ahead. I think sort of looking outside of COVID, this is something, flexible working, that actually has been on the agenda for quite some time. And there have been calls on the government for quite some time now to make some changes. And I think looking back to sort of December last year, which is obviously before we found ourselves in the situation we do now, but the Queen's speech at Christmas last year, she did touch upon the employment bill, which is something that the government had looked to bring forward. And part of that was that the government had looked to implement change in respect to flexible working. And that is an intention really subject to consultation to make flexible working the default position. So that's really just a case of considering how that's going to look moving forward. And obviously that's all on hold at the moment and we don't know what that's going to look like. But things such as reducing the time frame to consider the request. So obviously at the moment it's 3 months, but there are calls for that to be reduced. There are also calls for employers when they are advertising job roles to set out within the job advert whether that should be whether that's a flexible role or not. So these are all sorts of things that I think we are looking at moving forward. And I think we all know that it's, you know, likely to be the case that our working arrangements are likely to be disrupted for some time. You know, we are sort of working as we are for now. And I think, you know, with that in mind, and in terms of, you know, looking at moving back to the workplace, it's likely that employers are going to probably look to take a flexible approach with how that looks in the early phases as employees are sort of reintroduced to the workplace as and when that happens. Working environment, as we know, it's likely to be subject to review and adaptation as measures are eased or otherwise. Obviously, we know at the moment we've now sort of gone a step back in terms of workplaces, but that, you know, will be hopefully, you know, reduced at some time in the future. And we just don't know whether that's going to be a cyclical thing, whether we're going to sort of have workplaces opened and need to be closed again. So it's just really being mindful of that, I suppose. There may also be employees, I think, as you all might know, who live with those that are vulnerable, etc. And they may have concerns about coming into work for that reason. And it's just considering, obviously, the impact of that upon flexible working as well, and any request that's made to continue working from home moving forward. And really planning how we do that and what we look at, you know, in terms of our workforce, really. Have we got any questions on that?
No, not from me.
No. So this phrase that we all love, the new normal. So again, you know, it's a case of thinking about how we look at our ways of working. Are we going to go back to the old way, or do we like how we're working at the moment? I think, you know, as I'd said, referring back to that survey that had been completed, I think, you know, a lot of employees have enjoyed working from home, but just because, you know, employees may have enjoyed it, is it working for the business? So have you seen an impact upon productivity as a result of working from home? And, you know, is that going to work for your business moving forward, or is it not? And it's important that obviously we give consideration to this and we think about how we look at, you know, how we work moving forward and looking towards the future. You know, what else can we do? So I think, you know, as a team, we've certainly been using technology more and more. I think Emma knows I'm a bit of a technophobe, so it's been an experience. But, you know, there are obviously things we're going to have to think about. So social distancing, is it, you know, better to have less employees in the workplace, because that enables you then to facilitate social distancing for the time that we need to do that? You know, what's the impact of that going to be upon our clients and our suppliers? Has the current situation changed our attitude to flexible working? And I think really, as you said there, it's an opportunity really for employers to capitalise on the change. You know, are the things that we could do that actually are going to be better for the business as well moving forward, and are actually going to make things better in terms of our working practices. Have the next slide. So yeah, so in terms of further considerations just around that, two of the key things really that we would say are really, really important here are policies and data. So as you've got more and more staff working at home or working from home, you just need to really think about the policies that you have in place, and data really. So in terms of policies, you know, have we got a remote health and safety policy? You know, we need to make sure we're thinking about these things, because you know, it's important that as an employer, we are considering how working from home impacts upon the health and safety risks created by an employee. Health and Safety at Work Act, that gives a general duty for employers to look after the health, safety and welfare of our employees whilst they're working. And also, you know, we've obviously got a duty of care. So it's a case of just thinking about these things. And if we don't currently have a policy in place that covers off home working and health and safety, you know, do we need to do that? Equally, you know, in terms of home working, how is that going to work? You know, what is your expectation upon the employee in terms of that working? You know, have you got expectation around logging of hours or things like that? You know, it's just thinking about sort of generically, what things do you need to be thinking about where somebody isn't necessarily in your direct sight line. In terms of data, this is a massive one. Where employees are obviously working from home, you know, you haven't got that same control over the data that they are accessing, who can see that data, where potentially they're having confidential telephone calls, who's listening to those telephone calls, have they got confidential paperwork, is that sort of left out and around, and can people see that, and what do we do about that? You know, what sort of levels of control can we put in place, and what have you communicated to your employees in terms of expectation really? Obviously it creates a lot of challenges. It's not easy, it's not straightforward, and there is also an increased risk, I think, at the moment, certainly of cyber attacks as well. The fact that we're in the middle of a global pandemic at the moment, unfortunately it doesn't exempt an employer from their obligations in terms of data protection or security. And you know, as I've said, really the rise in home working, I think, has led to data being increasingly vulnerable, either to compromise or to human error. So it's just thinking about what we can do to try and put safeguards in place really. Have the next slide. So what do we do, you know, in terms of variation of that contract? We need to obviously discuss that with the employee, what it is, you know, in terms of changes, explain why and how long that will take place for, and ultimately make sure that we have regular reviews that are going to happen, so that at an appropriate times, whether that's a month, whether that's 2 months, we're really sitting with the employee and going over how that's worked, and whether it's something that either you and the employee want to put in place moving forwards permanently or not, and the reasons for both. It might be that the employee requested this, but actually once they've trialed it out, they decide it's not for them and they don't want to run with it moving forward. And you know, they themselves may decide that actually it doesn't work for them. So you know, it's just a case really of having that regular review and doing this by agreement, so that all of this is covered off in the right way really. Do we have any questions?
No, not from me.
Does anybody want to discuss any issues that they're having currently with any employees or process, whether it be by implementing policy or paperwork?
No.
No. Okay, that's fine. Well, I hope then you've all found that useful. As it's Caim mentioned earlier, it has been recorded, so you can access it after if you feel it necessary to do so. But you can contact us, as you can see on the screen here. There's 3 teams that make up the employment team at Napfens. HR3 team, who Natalie sits within, which will support you on everyday employment related issues with your staff members, and also post employment if it goes a little bit wrong with some employees. Myself, as I work in people projects, we assist clients on a variety of different projects, whether that be training. We can come in and conduct people reviews to assist you with your strategy, or we can take that process from you if you'd like. And if you don't want to handle with that employee, I can come in and I can deal with that employee for you, of course. And then ATG, they're now actually classed as NAPFN's Health and Safety, and they also are our own team who come in and run audits for you, provide guidance and support in a very similar way to HR3, and will support the business from a health and safety capacity. So there's lots of support that we can offer you as your business if you feel it's necessary. And if you do want any further information on any of those services, then by all means contact myself or Natalie after this session. You will find us on LinkedIn. Our contact details are on the NAPFN's website as well. So by all means, pick the phone up and we can have a chat with you and talk for any concerns or issues that you may have currently. Does anybody have any questions before we finish then today? We've finished a little early than we planned.
Nope, thank you for that.
No, absolutely fine.
Very much.
Right, that's fine then. Well, we will let you all get back to your days, and hopefully we won't be hearing too many more announcements from the government that are all going to make our life even more interesting over the coming weeks, and we can have a few quieter weeks coming up. Hopefully lockdown isn't going to have too much of an impact on yourselves, and might just give you some time to get ahead of the game, should we say, some of these things. I know some businesses in relation to lockdown last time utilised that time to sort out policies and procedures and things because they weren't dealing with their everyday busy schedules. So but as I say, if there is any questions, anything you want to come and talk to us about, by all means pick the phone up. Okay, I think we will end the session there then today.
Thank you very much. It was very useful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, bye.